Welcome to Prophecy Views. I'm Brian Barton. I wanted to come to you real quickly in regards to the situation going on between China and Taiwan. You know, China has been threatening for years to take back Taiwan. They claim it's part of China. They force all of the nations since China has become part of the UN. They have forced all the nations to basically declare a one China policy. And so nations like the U.S. have tiptoed around being allies with Taiwan, but yet still claiming to have a one China policy. Now, China has saber rattled for quite some time over this issue of Taiwan. They really haven't done much about it until recently with the Biden administration. I think they feel like, since the U.S. is pretty weak, that they have a great opportunity now to strike on Taiwan. So, with that being said, everything now is pointing to China attacking Taiwan to take it back. And that hasn't been the top focus of, I've kept an eye on it, but that hasn't been the top focus when I am looking at the 6th Trumpet War. And we're going to go to that scripture here in just a minute. But that hasn't been on my radar significantly. I mean, I do keep an eye on it, but it's not been significant because we know that the spark from this war, and we're going to read the scripture, that the spark of this war comes from the Euphrates River, which is Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And so a conflict with China and Taiwan really doesn't come to play with that. I'm not saying that it wouldn't be a bad war and there wouldn't be lives lost and things of that nature, and as horrible as that is. But in terms of looking at it from the 6th trumpet perspective, and let's go to that scripture right now so that as I refer to it, you can follow right along with me. And we're in Revelation 9, and this is verses 13 through 18, and this is going to be describing the 6th trumpet. Verse 13, and the 6th angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar which is before God, saying to the 6th angel which had the trumpet, loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. And the four angels were loosed which were prepared for an hour, a day, a month, and a year, for to slay the third part of men. And we know this is a war, so I'm now off scripture. We know this is a war because of what the next passage says. So no matter all the different translations that you look at, that last one I read was verse 15, where a third part of men, to slay a third part of the men. If you look at that in different translations, I mean, it talks about a third of the human population of the earth. So at this point in time, you're talking, about 2.8 billion people, give or take. But we know that this is a physical war because of the next verse, and I'm going to go right into verse 16. And the number of the army of the horsemen were 200,000, and I heard the number of them. So verse 16 tells us that this is militaristic. And then we're going to go on down to 17. And thus I saw the horses in the vision, and them that sat on them, having breastplates of fire, and of jacinth, and of brimstone. And the heads of the horses were as lions, and out of their mouths issued fire, and smoke, and brimstone. And here is verse 18. By these three was the third part of men killed, by the fire, and by the smoke, and by the brimstone which issued out of their mouths. So twice this set of scriptures, this 6th trumpet description, tells us within just a few verses that a third of the human race is going to be killed. But it specifically tells us to loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. So we are looking for that spark along the Euphrates River. Now, almost none of the casualties, this is interesting, very little of the casualties appear to be along the Euphrates River, because those countries are later mostly mentioned to come against Jerusalem, Israel, Jerusalem specifically, at the Battle of Armageddon. So we know that these nations, which aren't all that big in population to begin with, a few million each of them, they aren't that large of nations. They must not be hit very hard during this war. And a scenario like this could explain that, because I'm going to show you what happened over a few days ago on a Sunday morning interview with Lindsey Graham. And he did an interview with, I believe, Shannon Bream on Fox News. And interestingly, he said this.
I'd let the Chinese know if you blockade Taiwan, you're going to have a hard time getting oil from the Mideast. I would increase training and give the F-16s they need in Taiwan. There's a backlog. I would solve that backlog. I would move more forces to South Korea and Japan. I would put nuclear-tipped cruise missiles in all of our submarines all over the world, like the Russians did when they got out of the nuclear treaty and started using cruise missiles, nuclear tip. That's what Reagan did in the Cold War. So I would up our game. And if you don't up your game now, you are going to have a war.
So Lindsey Graham says that if China puts a blockade around Taiwan, now why does this bother us? Because we get a lot of our chips and a lot of our computer parts and things of that nature from Taiwan. We are a very heavy trading partner with Taiwan. But notice that he said if China puts a blockade around Taiwan, that we should put a blockade of their oil coming out of the Middle East. Well, they get a lot of their oil now from Iran. And the place that you would be doing a blockade on their Middle East oil would be in the Strait of Hormuz coming out of Iran. Well, now all of a sudden, that is right where the Euphrates River empties out into the Gulf. So now there's that spark. So all of a sudden, we blockade the oil for China, and that would be that potentially is the straw that breaks the camel's back, which would explain why the spark is along the Euphrates River, but the majority of the casualties are elsewhere. And that makes a lot of sense. So it's something really to keep your eye on. I would be remiss if I did not put a podcast out on this. But the other thing to keep in mind, too, the powers that be in this world, and mainly in the United States, not mainly in the United States, but that are controlling the majority of things that are going on between the EU and also the United States. But those powers that are behind the scenes that are controlling the figures like George Soros and people like that, those figures that are controlling everything that's going on, they have an extremely highly vested interest in keeping the U.S. dollar strong, because that's where they're heavily invested. So the U.S. is concerned about what's been happening lately. The U.S. is concerned about the economic ties between China and that they have now with Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, and some other countries. They've started to move off of the U.S. dollar as their reserve currency. And what that means is they call it the petrodollar as well. And so when oil is purchased from one nation to the other, everything is converted into U.S. dollars. The country that's purchasing the oil converts to U.S. dollars and then purchases the oil. But these countries are sick and tired of the United States sanctioning everything, and so they are getting together a pretty big axis of nations that are saying, you know what, we're going to move off of the U.S. dollar. Well, if enough countries come off the U.S. dollar, it's going to crash the U.S. dollar. And that's terrible for us as people that live in the U.S. And this isn't all about us, but I'm saying the powers that be are really not going to allow that. And so they're going to start making chess moves to try to counter that. And here is their perfect excuse. If China goes in and starts bullying and blockading Taiwan, if China does that, and if one of our strategic moves is to then blockade the oil coming out of the Straits of Hormuz, which is coming out of Iran, I could see very likely that would skirmish into and cycle out of control. China thinks that they are very powerful right now. And all it takes is something like that, and that spark could start World War III. I'm not trying to put fear in anybody. We always have the assurity of salvation in Jesus Christ. So whatever happens, you're always safe. If you're fearful of this, the best thing to do is to make sure you're saved. But these nations have started using already. They've started using the Chinese currency, the yuan, for purchase of oil and other commodities. So this is not good news for the powers that be. It's not good news for us as U.S. citizens, but it's not good news for the powers that be. And China is really flexing its muscle right now. And with them being in bed militaristically with Russia, now we know that Russia appears to come out of this okay, because they are one of the main forces that comes against Israel, Jerusalem at the Battle of Armageddon that we see in Zechariah 14. But the funny thing is, when you start getting into the final 3.5 years, when the scripture really starts getting very descriptive about nations that are involved in things and nations that you see on the face of the earth during that final 3.5 years, there's no nation symbol for the nation of China. And you say, well, China is the dragon is mentioned. You will specifically find in scripture that when it says the dragon, it is telling you, and it says this, that old dragon and serpent, Satan himself. So when you see the dragon mentioned in Bible prophecy, it's talking about Satan. At no point in time, other than potentially this 200 million man army that we just saw depicted in the 6th Trumpet in Revelation 9, other than that, we really don't see any type of depiction of China. So let's keep an eye on this. Don't lose sleep over it. I'm not trying to put fear into anybody. We're not of a spirit of fear. God is the scripture says, I do not give you a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of sound mind. So let's keep our wits about us. But I would be remiss if I didn't bring this to the microphone. So let's keep an eye on this China-Taiwan thing now, and see if we start blockading oil in the Middle East. So we're always keeping an eye on that Euphrates River. Thanks for popping in on this podcast. I really, truly appreciate it. We've got some pretty big stuff coming. We've got a new studio coming here in a couple of months, and so we'll be back up in video format at that time. I appreciate the people, the sponsors and things that not sponsors, but the people that really make this ministry possible. I thank you for our supporters. We have some items coming out for them as well. We'll keep you posted on this as things happen. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon. God bless.